Okay, so the political climate in Den Haag. Well, it feels pretty charged right now.
Yeah, definitely. The coalition parties are deep in negotiations for the spring budget, the Voorjaarsnota.
And it sounds like, I mean, there are some real sticking points internally.
Seems that way. Plus, you've got all these competing priorities, and then, the whole global economic picture.
Right, can't ignore that. The whole Trump factor, potential trade wars, it hangs over everything. Makes you wonder what's really driving our national finances.
It's a really complex mix, isn't it? Domestic politics rubbing up against these big international economic currents.
A real balancing act.
Definitely. Numbers, future scenarios, all of it.
And that complexity, that's exactly why this BNR interview with Sandra Flippen seemed perfect for a deep dive.
She's the chief economist at ABN, yeah.
Well, actually, quick correction there. She's professor of sustainable banking at Groningen now. Used to be Erasmus, but Groningen now. Good to get that right.
A good catch.
Yeah.
Important detail. Helps frame her perspective, knowing her current role.
So, our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear. Let's dig into the core economic insights Sandra Flippen offered on this spring budget.
Trying to understand what a top economist sees as the key issues, right? Beyond just the political noise here.
Exactly. And considering the global uncertainty, too, you flagged this interview probably wanting to cut through the headlines and get to the real economic forces.
Yeah, trying to understand what's fundamentally at play.
So let's unpack what Sandra Flippen sees as crucial. Okay, first up, the Voorjaarsnota itself. She has an interesting take on how it's being used, doesn't she?
She really does. And this is key, I think, for understanding the whole debate.
Yeah.
Her concern is that the Voorjaarsnota is sort of turning into a second Miljoenennota.
A second main budget, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of this being what it was designed for.
Which was? What was its original job?
Its job is really just to be an update. How's the current budget doing? Are there big deviations, windfalls maybe, or setbacks?
Like a mid-year financial checkup for the country?
Precisely. But her worry is it's becoming this vehicle for, pushing through new spending plans.
Right. And she points out we already have a system for this stuff.
Uh-huh. She emphasizes that the Netherlands actually has a pretty well-ordered budgeting system.
Yeah.
It uses trend-based policies. And she mentions these Chinese walls.
Okay, Chinese walls. What does that mean in this context?
It's basically internal rules, safeguards to stop unexpected money, like a windfall, from just being spent straight away on something new without proper thought.
So there are processes,
Yeah, established ways of managing the finances.
which, thinking about wanting clarity and not getting swamped by details, helped explain what this spring budget should be for.
Exactly. Understanding the system's design helps you judge if what's happening now makes sense fiscally.
Okay, let's pivot then. The big external thing, global economic uncertainty. That Trump factor the interviewer brought up.
Yeah, I mean, the volatility coming out of the White House,
Yeah.
policies, even just the talk.
Yeah.
It definitely has a big economic ripple effect globally. Markets react so fast.
Feels like the ground's always shifting.
It can feel like that.
Yeah.
But Flippen makes a really good point here. She contrasts those quick market jumps with the discussions she sees at places like the Dutch Central Bank, DNB, and Bruegel in Brussels.
Okay.
She describes those discussions as calm, stable, strategic, and systematic. They're talking about Europe's long-term strategic position with all these trade tensions.
Ah, so while the news focuses on the daily ups and downs, the experts are playing a longer game.
That's the key difference she's highlighting. And she really hopes the Dutch budget talks take that strategic view like DNB and Bruegel rather than just reacting to, market jitters or the latest tweet.
Which sort of echoes what Prime Minister Scoof and BBB's Henk Vermeer were saying about keeping a cool head.
Right. So there's at least an awareness politically that a cautious approach is needed.
Let's hope that cool head prevails then.
Generally a better way to handle economic policy, for sure. Long-term thinking over short-term reactions.
But then Flippen throws a bit of a curveball. She suggests that while everyone's looking outwards, the government here might be burying its head in the sand on big domestic stuff.
Yeah, that's a really striking part of her analysis.
And focusing instead on koopkraak-maatregelen, purchasing power measures which she thinks aren't even needed right now.
Exactly. She argues they're potentially distracting from the big long-term challenges by focusing on these short-term boosts to household spending.
Why does she think they're not needed? That seems counterintuitive with all the cost of living talk.
Well, her point is pretty direct. Wage growth has actually overtaken inflation now. She mentions her team at ABN AMRO has payment data analysis coming out soon, that apparently shows this.
Mm. So the picture might be more complex than just crisis.
That seems to be her view. More nuanced than the political narrative often suggests.
Okay, so if you're hearing constant talk about the cost of living, Flippin offers a different angle. Definitely worth noting.
It is. And her worry is that this focus on, like, quick fixes now.
Throwing short sugar, I think was her
Yeah,
phrase.
exactly. It feels good temporarily, but it doesn't solve underlying
Yeah.
problems and could leave us weaker when, real economic challenges hit later.
Like a Band-Aid when you need something more substantial. And for someone wanting to avoid feeling overwhelmed by constant fixes, this provides a counter-narrative.
Right. It encourages that wider view,
Mm.
thinking about long-term consequences versus immediate relief.
So if the focus shouldn't really be on those short-term measures, what does Flippin think the government should be tackling?
She's very clear on this. The absolute priority should be making the Netherlands more resilient for what could be a tough future. And that means tackling the major structural issues, the Groot dossiers, she calls them.
The big files.
Yeah.
Okay, which ones does she flag specifically?
She lists three main ones initially. Nitrogen emissions,
Always a big one.
yeah, then defense spending and capabilities,
Okay.
and upgrading our electricity infrastructure. And then later on, she adds the housing market as the fourth crucial one. But she kind of implies progress there depends a lot on sorting out the first three.
They all sound massive
Yeah.
and interconnected. She stresses that, right?
Oh, absolutely. Like, if you need big infrastructure projects, say for defense or the grid, that immediately bumps up against nitrogen limits because of construction land use.
It all ties together.
Totally. And building more houses needs infrastructure too. It's like she says the nitrogen space is limited, so we need to be really strategic about how we use it across all these priorities.
Like a complex puzzle, solving one piece helps unlock others, but one bottleneck holds things up.
Exactly that. Tackling these fundamentals is key for long-term stability, in her view.
Okay, let's talk about debt then. We hear so much about deficits, but Flippin actually points out the Netherlands has a budget surplus right now, something like 8 billion euros.
That's right, yeah. Which naturally leads to the question, what do we do with it?
And we've heard some parties, PVV and BBB mention, suggesting we should use the borrowing room we have under EU rules.
Yeah, the argument is that Netherlands is well below the EU's 60% debt to GDP limit. We're around 40%, maybe even less. So they say, why not use that capacity?
Makes sense on the surface. What's Flippin's view?
She's quite nuanced. She says, yes, using debt can be okay. But, and this is the crucial part, only for investments that benefit the future.
Like what?
Things like fixing the nitrogen problem, boosting defense, modernizing that infrastructure, tackling the housing crisis, things that will pay off down the road.
Okay, investing for the future, not just spending now.
Precisely. She contrasts that sharply with using debt for, say, short-term consumption, like helping everyone with energy bills again. She argues that just puts the burden on future generations without creating lasting value.
Strategic investment versus immediate spending. Got it.
It's about smart allocation, not just expediency.
Now, the interviewer brought up a question from D66 MP Hans Velbrief about the role of Dutch banks in solving current problems. That must have been tricky for her, being ABN AMRO's chief economist.
Yeah, she handled it carefully. She made it clear straight away she's giving her economist view, not speaking for the bank on strategy.
Understood. So what was her perspective on the bank's potential role?
She looked back at recent crises, the energy crunch, the pandemic. She pointed out that the big Dutch banks did play a major role then.
How so?
Things like letting people defer loan payments, participating in those government-backed loan guarantees for businesses. She credits those actions with helping prevent a wave of bankruptcies.
So banks have stepped up before in tough times.
They have. But she also added a bit of critical reflection. She kind of questioned whether the push to keep every business afloat might have accidentally propped up some that weren't really viable long-term.
Ah, that's interesting. The potential unintended consequences of broad support.
Yeah, it highlights how complex these interventions are. Then the talk shifted to the current debate. Should we keep giving energy support to the really big energy-using companies?
Which is a hot topic right now. Big arguments on both sides.
And Flippin brings up a really fundamental point about our tax system, how it's historically given large energy users lower rates for more consumption.
Effectively a fossil fuel subsidy, right?
That's how she frames it, yeah. It reduces the incentive to cut consumption.
Okay.
And then she links that to the bigger picture. Europe is heading towards a fossil-free economy. So, she argues, continuing to support heavy fossil fuel use risks creating stranded assets,
companies or investments that just lose value because the world moved on from fossil fuels.
Exactly. But then there's the counter-argument.
Hmm.
What if costs get too high and these companies just leave the Netherlands?
Yeah.
Job losses, etc.
The standard concern. How does she address that?
She acknowledges it's a real concern. Her solution isn't about just cutting off fossil fuels immediately. She talks about needing a stable transition.
Okay, managed process.
Yes, and she sees a big role for the government here, investing heavily in public, good energy infrastructure. Think renewables, grid upgrades.
Right. And here's the really interesting bit. She suggests making participation in that new green infrastructure a condition for getting government help during the transition.
That's the core idea. Basically, you want support, fine, but you have to hook into the new system, commit to decarbonizing.
So, no opting out and still getting help.
That seems to be the mechanism she's suggesting. Use government investment and support to actively mandate participation in the shift away from fossil fuels.
Yeah.
The government has to drive it.
Creates a powerful incentive, maybe even a requirement for companies to get on board with sustainability.
That's the logic.
Yeah.
Align the economic incentives with the green transition goals. Invest in the infrastructure, then tie support to using it.
Okay, moving on. The interview also touched on economic forecasts, specifically the CPB, the Central Planning Bureau. That's another regular political football, isn't it? Especially with someone like Peter Omtzigt.
Yeah, Omtzigt from NSC has been quite vocal, suggesting the CPB forecasts tend to be too pessimistic, which then leads to these budget surpluses appearing later.
Implying the government has more money to spend than the CPB lets on.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
That's the implication. But Flippen really pushes back on that.
How so?
She calls it a somewhat false accusation. She really stresses the CPB's independence and that its job is to make forecasts based on the policy plans the government gives it.
Ah, so the CPB isn't making policy, it's just calculating the likely outcome if the government follows its own plans.
Exactly. And Flippen argues that when forecasts don't match reality, it's often because of government underspending.
Meaning?
Meaning the government didn't actually implement all the policies or spending it said it would, the stuff the CPB based its forecast on. So the deviation isn't necessarily a bad forecast, it's a failure of implementation.
Which loops back to her earlier point about the government maybe struggling to execute plans, burying its head in the sand.
It does connect, yes.
Yeah.
If the policy isn't enacted as planned, the economic outcome will naturally differ from the forecast based on that plan. She thinks blaming the CPB for that isn't quite fair.
Right, that makes sense. Finally, then, the interviewer asks her a really direct question. If she could ask the CDA representative something, knowing the CDA might be key in the first chamber for budget approval, what would it be?
And her answer is quite provocative. She said she'd ask, "What is your plan to make the Netherlands relevant again in Europe?"
Wow, relevant again. That's a strong statement. What's behind that?
It really sums up her broader worry, I think. She basically says the Netherlands isn't being taken seriously enough in Europe right now, on multiple fronts.
Why does she think that?
She points to this huge agenda happening across Europe, trying to build a more resilient, independent, productive union. She even cites an IMF projection, suggesting that if Europe actually does all its homework on things like deepening the single market, it could resolve nearly half the internal trade frictions and maybe boost productivity by up to 7%.
Yeah.
Huge potential gains.
So big strategic stuff happening at the EU level.
Massive stuff. And Flippen's concern is that the Netherlands just isn't engaged enough. We're too caught up in our own domestic squabbles and short-term fixes, maybe.
And missing the bigger European picture.
That seems to be her fear, that we're not playing a meaningful role, not being influential where these big decisions are being shaped.
Okay, so let's try and wrap up the main threads from Sandra Flippen for you. There's definitely a strong call to focus hard on those big structural challenges: nitrogen, defense, energy, housing.
Yeah, get the fundamentals right.
She's critical of the current political focus on short-term purchasing power measures, arguing they might not even be needed now.
And could distract from the bigger tasks.
She stresses taking a long-term view, especially on the energy transition, using government investment strategically to drive change.
And tying support to participation in that change.
And underlying it all is this quite pointed concern about whether the Netherlands is losing its relevance and influence within Europe.
Her core message really feels like an urging. Netherlands, get your head out of the sand, face the big domestic issues, and re-engage strategically with Europe. Don't get lost in short-term noise.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. Thinking about Flippen's perspective, What does relevance actually mean for a country like ours in today's world, this interconnected, fast-changing place?
Hmm.
And maybe what's the real cost if we don't tackle those huge dossiers she laid out? Something to definitely keep thinking about.